I am Rochelle Wilhite. I'm the designated broker of Best Choice Realty. Tonight, we're going to be covering the home sale contingency. It has been a little bit of time. Shannon informed me how long it's been since we actually covered some of the forms. But tonight, I really want to go over the fundamentals of the home sale contingencies because they are on the rise. We are seeing more instances where either agents from other companies lack the skill set to be able to create the forms, or you just need to understand some basic fundamentals tonight. So I'm going to go over from the listing perspective as well as from the buyer perspective when in terms of the home sale contingencies. If you just jumped on, if you have questions or if you have comments, you're welcome to pop it in the chat and we will have time to cover that at the end. But I do have a weighty topic, lots to cover, a lot of paperwork to look at tonight. So I have a screen picture on the screen that covers dominoes. And I always kind of talk about when we're in a domino game, right? There's one thing that leads to another thing that leads to another thing, and that becomes more complex. And I would say if buyers and sellers have home sale contingencies or are buying and then selling, they definitely need a real estate broker because there's a lot that can happen. And so you do have to have an understanding. If you are a new broker, I would consider home sale contingencies as more of an intermediate type of learning. So if you feel really solid about the buy side process or you feel really solid about the listing process, home sale contingencies really bridge the gap between those two different types of situations. And you definitely don't want to be in the middle of the domino or the start of the domino and not have the experience to know how to deal with home sale contingencies. So that's tonight's topic. We're going to go to the next slide, Shannon. So what is a home sale contingency? How do you get in on the domino game? Well, you have two options in the state of Washington. You have the buyer's house is already under contract, which you're going to use a 22Q. If the home is not on the market yet, you're going to use a Form 22B. Again, this is Washington state specific contracts or forms. You're going to want to make sure that as well as including all of a typical, the finance contingency, the inspection contingency, and all the forms that are associated with drafting a contract, that you also consider including the 22Q or the 22B, depending on your situation. Every state is different, and the MLSs handle the status changes differently as well. If you are working with somebody in Washington, you still may be handling a home sale contingency, but you may not be the one handling the sale. You might be handling the purchase, and you'll have to work with that other broker from another state. So I'm going to talk about some of those instances tonight. A lot of questions need to be answered. The most important questions, I think, when it comes to playing dominoes or using home sale contingencies would be, what questions do I need to ask? And how do I phrase this? Really want to think about moving dates, possession dates, listing dates. Oh my, it's kind of like there's so many dates going on, not to mention that there's contingency dates within the contingency, the home sale contingency, such as inspections and earnest money deposits and all kinds of dates. So it becomes overwhelming for a buyer who actually has a home to sell to handle all of these contractual elements. And that's why they need an experienced broker like you. So you need to be prepared to ask the questions and ask them bluntly. Negotiations, another important point of playing dominoes, is that if you do represent a buyer who has a home sale contingency or you have a seller who's accepted a home sale contingency, you need to understand that negotiations and showings will still occur. And it's very likely that that will happen in a marketplace that like we're in right now. So be prepared for that. Make sure you set the proper expectations. But the most important thing I want you guys to take away from tonight's session or training is not to sell the property twice. That can happen because you don't understand your forms, or you have not done a home sale contingency and you use the improper forms. And if you sell the home twice, say to the listing agent, and you actually are in contract with two separate buyers and you're not using the right forms, in essence, you could run the risk that you could be breaching your duties. You could lose your license and you could be fined or sued. So we definitely do not want to sell the property twice. This is the disclaimer that they put on the Northwest MLS, that if the seller sells to the contingent buyer and then signs a second purchase and sale agreement without using the second buyer addendum, the seller has in essence sold the property twice. I'm getting questions about home sale contingencies just about daily now. So as we see the market kind of changing in our local neighborhoods, you're going to need to understand some of your forms, and you might need to dust them off. Some of you have not used the Form 39 or the second buyer addendum or the home sale contingency addendum maybe in 5-6 years. It's been that long. So we want to make sure that you have the right skill set to be able to know what you don't know. And if in fact you have not used a home sale contingency or ever, or maybe you have not listened to this recording, that you reach out and you call somebody in my office and we have that conversation. All of my staff has been trained on home sale contingencies and to answer certain questions, especially if they're licensed, but if they're not licensed, they know that those questions need to go to me. We don't want to have a property sold twice or have any lawsuits or issues with clients in this process. Let's go to the next slide. So if you are a seller or if you represent a listing, some of the things you want to think about when you're representing the seller is like the price. Maybe you've priced it pretty high. And so the likelihood of you actually getting a buyer at that price, it may be somebody that has a home to sell. So it's going to take longer for it to sell, but that buyer is liking your property so much so that they're willing to take the risk, put up the inspection money, get things going, have it, get started with the financing, knowing that the seller is going to let them have the time to sell their home. So many of the luxury properties, many of the upper price points, they do have these opportunities that kind of start to appear when the market starts to shift, where sellers start to get creative and say, okay, if I want my $1.5 million price point, I'm going to need to probably have that $700,000 buyer sell their home in order to afford my home. And it kind of works that way. So you actually can increase your price point if you're a listing agent just by learning how to do home sale contingencies or knowing how to converse or speak or ask questions with those prospective buyers so that you can, in essence, play on both sides of the coin, or play in the domino game where you're representing a buyer, a seller, and then the sellers, maybe you're getting a referral fee for the home they're purchasing in another state. That's very possible and it's very real. And you can pretty much double or triple your income just by working with one client, but you're involved with maybe 2 or 3 other sales. The other thing you want to consider is the buyer's, if you're representing the seller in this instance where a buyer comes to you with a home sale contingency, you really want to understand, especially from other states, is that buyer's home already on the market? And if it has, is it pending? Is it past inspection? Is it past appraisal? Where are they in the process? Every state's unique in how they handle their home sale contingencies and how they handle their other kinds of contingencies like financing and appraisal. So it's best for you, especially if you're going to have maybe an offer coming in or you have another offer coming in that's not contingent on the sale of a home, that you understand all of the ramifications for your seller of that other property, this property that's in Tennessee or this property that's in Southern California. How long has that property been on the market? Are there offers on it? Is it pending? These are some of the questions you want to ask when you represent a seller or a listing and you have a home sale contingency that appears on your desk. Next slide. The skinning, this is a house that I represented. This was actually at the start of COVID. I actually represented the seller. The house is on the left. It was a beautiful home in Edgewood, Washington, 3-car garage. I mean, it was pretty much a new house when they bought it. And then they modernized the home, remodeled it, staged it. It was a beautiful home inside and out. It looked like a magazine inside the home. Beautiful lot in a very small CC&R community. But reviewing contingencies, they priced it pretty high. And again, we headed right into COVID in 2020. This was actually listed in January of 2020. And so we were in the middle of all of that. And so for many reasons, they chose a professional, experienced agent, myself, to help them because they realized they had a tall order. They were not really rushed on time. Timing was not an issue for them. So they could accept a home sale contingency, and they needed a professional, experienced agent to represent them in the negotiation that they knew would take place, because there would be a home that would most likely be sold in order for that person to afford this home in this particular location. So when I work with the seller, I wanted to understand, when I was sitting down and discussing with them, taking their listing, we understood the pricing point. We understood the demographics. We understood what they were desiring and their timeline, and how, if we did get an offer, I knew for a fact how they wanted me to handle their negotiation. The seller happened to be a dentist. He was a very busy dentist, and he was actually transferring his practice into a different state. But there was some time that needed to take place. And so they were willing to try it at a certain price point, drop to a certain price point, accept home sale contingencies at that price point. And certainly we wanted to look, we were not concerned about a bump clause. For them, it was all about timing. So we wanted to work with the seller to understand, would they just accept the offer outright? Would they reject it? Or would they accept a short bump clause? Really, bump clauses was not an issue for them. They were just really concerned about the timing and the negotiation that happened. Let's go to the next slide. So that's our subject. So we actually got a buyer. So the buyer actually had a home sale contingency. It was actually a condo, downtown condo in Ruston Way. It was a view condo, but this is right before COVID happened. They were actually wanting to have more of a lot. They'd actually downsized. That was the kind of the demographic of this particular buyer. They had sold their single property residence, moved into a luxury condo, didn't like the condo feel. They thought they would love it, but after only being there for 2 years, they actually wanted to go back to having a single family residence that had a yard, that was in a nice community, and that was in a strategic location like Edgewood. So in that type of marketplace, which the marketplace was kind of topsy-turvy, kind of like it is right now, at the start of COVID, it was very hard to attract buyers, obviously, to even get showings when COVID happened. And so I came to the sellers with an offer, and this offer was a home sale contingency. So we looked at their condo, and we certainly said we have a chance. In fact, timing was not an issue. We even extended their home sale contingency during COVID, so that the sellers had more time to negotiate where they were going to end up and extend their contingency. So we talked about that, and as luck would have had it, or unlucky for these particular buyers, we ended up having to bump them. So I'm going to go over that here in a minute, of how we went about this process, and I'll show you the actual paperwork. So in a competitive market, when you're working with a buyer, we just had a buyer offer on one of our listings tonight. And it was funny because the listing agent called me and was like, it's not a Best Choice Realty buyer, Rochelle, or a Best Choice Realty buyer's agent, but oh my gosh, the paperwork was super, super sloppy. I'm not going to show you some sloppy paperwork tonight, but there's a lot of sloppy paperwork and uneducated buyer's agents that do not understand that we're still in a competitive marketplace in a lot of cases. And if you are going to represent a buyer who has a home sale contingency, you probably don't want to offer maybe $40,000 or $50,000 off the price if you're trying to bump somebody out of position. And you certainly want to understand that the seller is taking their home off the market and giving you a shot to sell their home. So that's one more kind of like red flag. If they're already going to be accepting a finance contingency, a price reduction, maybe an inspection contingency that's 10 days, there's just one more contingency that they have to consider. So you want to think about that when you're structuring it from the buyer standpoint, and really educate your buyers that the sellers view a home sale contingency as risky, because there's no guarantee that the home will sell. In this case, this condo, actually I looked it up just in preparation for tonight's call, just to see if it actually ended up selling after we bumped them. It wasn't until 2022, January of 2022, where this condo actually sold. So it took a lot longer, took almost 2 years with 2 different real estate brokers to actually get this condo sold. So, I mean, we did make the right choice back in 2020 with what we did, but sometimes it's a risk that the sellers will have to take. So if you're representing a buyer who is looking at a home sale, writing a 22B or a home sale contingency, make sure that they're very firm in some of the other terms so that you have a higher likelihood that the seller will accept your offer. When the sellers do accept your offer, we will look very closely at your pricing, and we'll be reviewing just the listing and marketing in general. So it's almost like you have another set of eyes, whether you like it or not. The listing agent's going to be very much clued into your marketing. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, Shannon. So go ahead and put up the offer that included the 22B. And I believe this is from started with a P back in the day. So while she's doing that, if you want to chat a few notes, or if you have a question at this time, go ahead and pop that in the chat. She's going to go ahead and show you guys the offer, and it's going to show you what I received back in 2020 for these sellers that had this beautiful home in Edgewood. There we go. So this is a Washington state contract. Idaho is going to be a much easier contract. But as far as the Washington state contract, you're going to have a contract that looks like this. It has all the contingencies. Notice that it has the 22B, number 16. Addenda line 22B, that means they have a home sale, a contingency contingent on the home that they have to sell. So although we got the price, 900 was what we offered or what they offered us. So we got the full price and a $9,000 earnest money check. Definitely want at least 1%. Certainly we could have countered with more. But again, my sellers, their biggest concern was they actually needed time. They wanted to have a buyer for their property so that they could also work out the details of the dental practice, as well as the purchase of where they're going to end up. So they wanted to have a buyer kind of in the wing, which is what we did here with this contract. Go ahead and scroll on down to 22B. So everything else is the same kind of contract, but the 22B is the home sale contingency for Washington. That means that they have to put their property on the market within 5 business days. Now, all the states don't have those tight provisions. Some states have 12 days. Some states have 15 days where they have time to put their home on the market. In Washington state, with the 22B, it says clearly on line number 10 that they must be licensed with a real estate firm, or it must be listed with the real estate firm within 5 days after mutual acceptance of this agreement. And then that would be breach of contract if that offer, or that listing out there in Grand Loop number 408, that condo did not hit the market within 5 days. Now on number 8, it says, a lot of people get this confused. That doesn't mean that I have to have it on the market by April 28th. It means I have to have it on the market within 5 days of mutual acceptance. I have to have a buyer secured, meaning a buyer who is mutual accepted or contract ratified before April 28th, 2020. That was the contingency, which was actually quite long. And when this offer was written February 29th, we allowed them to have until April 28th to actually get a buyer for their condo. Now, as we discussed earlier when I took the listing, they were not concerned about the bump. Having to go back and do this, and obviously I didn't foresee COVID happening, but certainly on February 29th, COVID was out there and we were getting, low amount of showings coming to the property, but they were not concerned about the bump. If I was to do this over again as a listing agent, as a market that's kind of transitioning, I would certainly have that conversation with your seller. The bump clause is up on that section, Shannon. Nope, go back to the 22B. It talks about the bump clause. Sorry, you have to go back to the 22B. I know I'm jumping around a little bit here tonight. But the bump clause is in the section here. It talks about the failure to close and the bump that's given. Scroll up to line, it's right there. Property remains on the market on number 4. Seller may keep the property on the market in the contingent status until the seller has received notice that the buyer has satisfied or waived the contingency. So it basically says, if I got another offer, I would have to give that buyer so this buyer right here that wrote up an offer, I'd have to give them 5 days to satisfy their contingency. It was kind of a nail biter. They actually received an offer in their condo during that bump period, but they were not able to secure it. And we ended up bumping them for an offer that was better in terms and better buyer that did not have a home to sell. So it was better for my sellers. But it was interesting. If I had it to do over again, I probably would have cut that contingency down, countered them on the bump period of 5 days, because it allowed that buyer 5 days. It allowed them right here that you're looking at 5 days to get an offer once I sent them the notice to bump them out of position. So if you're wanting to be very strategic, or your seller, and we're kind of in a marketplace where you may get a better offer that comes in, even in the contingent status, you may want to shorten down that bump clause, or that property remains on market. In some states, they call it something different. So just you need to look for that in your contract. Most contracts will have something like that. Then there's a contingency satisfied where we have to give, the buyer has to give notice. So once they do have an offer on their home or their condo, in this case, they had to give us notice within 2 days of entering into an agreement. They have a provision in this contract that says they have to give us 2 days of entering into that contract notice. Otherwise, they automatically waive all of the contingencies. So be very careful if you're a buyer's agent and you have not used a home sale contingency and it's a Washington state contract, that you watch those timelines and that you actually contact me and you're like, Rochelle, I need to run down the timelines with you. I haven't done this in a very long time. I'd rather have this conversation when you get mutual on the domino and you're playing dominoes in this way where you represent the buyer or you get a buyer and you're representing the seller. And we have these dominoes on all these timelines. It's better to have that conversation before you get mutual than after mutual and you're already on day 3 and you just waived everything. Again, you have to know your contracts. Washington state is very fussy as far as the timelines go. Idaho, not so much. But Washington, we've got to watch our timelines and watch those contingencies. Let's go to the next, the offer that comes in. So we went ahead and actually got we even gave them a 30-day extension on that 22B. If I went back and looked at that, we actually gave them an extension. But then we had another offer that came through. This is the offer that came through. This is a counteroffer. So we did get acceptance on the counteroffer, but you want to notice that on Form 39, I had to include a Form 39 because again, I don't want to sell the property twice. Remember, that's what I said to be very careful at doing. We don't want to sell the property twice. I already have something mutual. I already have something in the contingent status according to the Northwest MLS. So I've got my statuses correct, but now I've got a buyer who's like showed the property and absolutely loves it, who does not have a home sale contingency, who is going to be waiving contingencies. They've basically waived contingencies and they are wanting to, I have to fill the second buyer's addendum. So Poland happened to be, it was a seller and then Poland was the first buyer. So you actually have to fill that part in on Form 39. If you're if you're a buyer's agent and you're in this situation and you don't know, the status of like the home sale contingency, or maybe the listing agent has not, provided you with the Form 39, you can provide it, but it needs to be filled in on term 1. So just make sure that gets filled in on term 1. Or you put a backup addendum together. So maybe that's how you secure mutual acceptance, is being in a backup status until they can give notice and they can actually get out of that other contract. But second buyer's addendum is what you need, but you do have to have term 1 filled in as far as who was that buyer in buyer 1 position and when was their date, when was their buyer's property on or before that. We've got to put that date in there correctly. The other part that needs to be filled in would be, again, for you to figure out, the bump notice will not be given to the first buyer until the seller has received a notice from the seller. We could have had sellers, we could have dealt with the Form 17. We could have dealt with some other contingencies before we give notice. In this case, all they wanted to know is that we had the sump pump and the crawl space addressed that came up on the other inspection. So that was the only issue that they had. Everything else was good to go for them. So they were fine with us delivering notice and them going into position after I dealt with the sump pump issue that was in that place. They wanted a bump notice of 1 day. So I was able to deliver that just because of the way the timing worked out, but we should have had 5 days if we were to compare both contracts. But because of the timing and when this was delivered, we were fine with that. But again, you have to watch your timelines and know what you're doing here. You can't be just hurrying and filling this out. It's not easy when it comes to that kind of stuff. So the offer was pretty straightforward. It was $900,000 offer, $10,000 earnest money check, closing very quickly. At this point, the sellers were in contract with a home in California, and they had an offer for their dental practice. So they were in a position where they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They were like, we like the buyer number 1. We want them to get the deal, but they had to send the notice because they needed to move along. So we couldn't take the risk any longer. We'd already extended it once. We gave them an extra 30 days already on their 22B. And so we went ahead and forced their hand. We actually sent them the bump notice. So let's go ahead and look at that. So the Form 39 was accepted, counteroffer was accepted. We had a second buyer addendum in place, which then triggers in Washington state the bump notice to be given appropriately. So let's go ahead and look at that. So remember, Form 39 in Washington State, when you're using a second buyer addendum, but this bump notice had to be given. So it says seller gives notice that the seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property as permitted by the buyer's sale of property contingency as outlined in 22B. A bump notice is not given in 22Q. So a lot of you think, oh, well, it's a home sale contingency. Well, 22Q is already, the home is already pending. We do not use bump notices with 22Q. They do not go together. So we only use this with 22B as referenced here in the bump notice form 44. Unless buyer gives notice before the expiration of this bump period that the buyer has satisfied the contingency, this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money gets returned to buyer number one. The buyer shall use the bump response to respond to this notice. So they had to respond on a form 46. Shanna, if you could show that, that would be great. So we sent that. Remember, when you send notices though, they must be sent to the firm as well as to the agent that you're working with. So never think that just because it went to the agent, the buyer's agent, that they got it in their inbox. For delivery notices, for purposes of computation of time, always make sure you're delivering the notices to the firm as well as to the buyer's agent. In Idaho, it's a little bit different, but you know, they have a very just kind of easier going kind of contingency period and the communication period as well. But here you go with the, let's see, go to the bump notice. Nope, it's not that one. So we go to pull up form 46, I guess. I probably didn't attach it for you. Oh, there it is. 40, do they respond? I probably didn't send it to you. Sorry. Go ahead and pull up form 46 so they can see what that looks like on the MLS. It's actually good practice to show where to pull down, because some of these things are not easily, you almost have to memorize. And then if you're not used to using them, which many of you have not used them in years, you know, as far as the bump notice, they've changed them. In fact, back in the old days, they used to have all of the notices and the responses on like 4 or 5 pages, which was super confusing. And they now, back in 2017, they actually took them apart. 2017 in February, they took the bump reply and the bump response and they took it apart. So this is what the buyer's agent, they actually they had 5 days to respond. So they played it really hard. In fact, they did a price reduction. It was over the weekend. Like I said at the beginning of the call, if I had to do over again, I probably would have countered them, but I was honoring the sellers and their positioning where they actually did not want to be really harsh with how they countered that buyer, because they had not found a home to purchase at that time. But, you know, as luck or unluck would have it, they had 5 days and they made a really strong push. And then I end up on the day 5, it was a sad phone call that I got from the buyer's agent just saying, we did everything we could. We did a price reduction, and just as luck would have it, we just didn't come to terms with the purchaser, with the buyer that came to the table to honor their, you know, to write an offer on their condo. So they end up selecting the box where it says the buyer's property not sold, agreement terminated. They checked the 3rd box and they signed off. And I was then able to send the notice to the second buyers to put them into position. There is a notice to do that as well. If they, for some reason, if they did get a buyer, let's say that did come together, they could have said the buyer's property is sold and the contingency is satisfied. So the buyer has accepted an offer to sell that was, you know, not closing earlier than 30 days and not more than 60 days. And then they had to have a complete copy of that purchase and sale agreement. So if it would have come together, those buyers were like only a day or 2 away from making that happen. So we had only a day to make that happen. It was like playing football, and it was just like a fumble at the very end. It was just like, we were so close. And the listing agent of that property, who was also the buyer's agent who represented the buyers, she was super sad. We're still very, very good friends. She's at Windermere. We have done a lot of transactions together, and it's just the way it worked, the way the cookie crumbled. And it was unfortunate that the buyer's property could not sell. Sellers were elated because they had an actual date to work with, and they actually were satisfied because the property sold for the price that they had wanted all along. And they actually moved into their house in California, and they actually sold their dental practice, and everything went through very, very smoothly. So Very successful situation utilizing all of the forms that were available. I'm going to go ahead and just, for the interest, I got 5 minutes. I'm just going to pop open just so you guys can have fun and seeing how each state's different. I'm going to show you the Idaho contingency so you can see what that looks like. Their purchase and sale agreement's a lot smaller than ours with less forms that you have to be concerned about. But it is interesting that there is a home sale contingency that's drafted into one of the contracts we accepted. Let's go ahead and show that one, Shannon, if you could. Every state has different contracts, so you just want to kind of really look about home sale contingencies. And here is an example of an addendum where the seller has the right to continue to market the property. It's addendum number 1. It has the Bonner's Ferry, and it says other, section B, buyer's home in escrow with an accepted offer. And there's a contingency clause for 72 hours is basically what they have. So they have, it looks like a 3-day kind of situation where the home sale contingency, where the seller could give them notice and bump them into play. So again, there are contingencies like this. There's also additional non-refundable consideration, notwithstanding anything else in the contract, the buyer's waiver of the removal of this contingency, where they're throwing up $1,000 to show it's non-refundable. So they have some different ways that each state operates when it comes to home sale contingencies. So you do want to understand that these things happen. And if you're able to have conversations and talk very openly with your buyer or your seller about the risks and the benefits of accepting a home sale contingency, it can be in the benefit of either the seller or the buyer, depending on the situation. It is a way for you to open yourself up to more opportunities by playing on both sides of the escrow, right? Where a person's buying in Idaho and a person's buying in Washington. If I'm licensed in both states, I can represent both parties in those types of situations and not have any issues. And it makes the fluid communication go very, very, very well, because I'm not having to deal with 3 or 4 different agents. I'm basically the broker on each of those files. So there's definitely some things that can be, some creative things that can be done. Say, for example, the home for whatever reason is not selling. You can go back to the seller that you're in the home sale contingency and say, hey, we're looking to kind of maybe share in the pain, right? Maybe we have to do a price reduction of $10,000 and your home maybe is not going to sell if you go back to the market. Would you be open to taking a price adjustment of $5,000 and that offsets our loss of, say, $10,000? Maybe we can work creatively and amend the contract that we have with the home sale contingency. We removed the home sale contingency because I know if I price at this price point, we can get it done. So there's a lot that can be done by playing with the domino game and actually knowing your contracts and knowing them well. Certainly, if you have never done this before, that's where you need a managing broker or somebody who has worked on the listing side, who has worked with home sale contingencies to guide you or maybe assist you. Maybe you need to invite, if your home's not selling, and maybe you open yourself up to home sale contingencies and you advertise and you really speak to that demographic, you might be able to get it done. There are a lot of different creative avenues, but at the end of the day, what it comes to is price is going to determine whether you get an offer at all. So if you're not getting even offers, even contingent offers, then we may be priced too high. We need to look at a price reduction strategy, and then open ourselves up and get our sellers open to the possibility that, you know what, it might just take somebody looking to sell their home and we need to speak to that demographic, or we need to speak to that audience. So with that, I'll go ahead and adjourn. If there's any questions, go ahead and put that in the chat. I'll go ahead and open the lines. If you have questions, go ahead and unmute your line. Shannon, was there anything that I missed or needed to cover?
The only thing I think we needed to just mention, if in Washington, Northwest MLS, if you've got a home sale contingency and it does sell and you're using a 22B, the form to use is a 90K.
Good. Yes.
So that's the form that you're going to be looking for. But I think to Rochelle's point, home sale contingencies are complicated. So, before you get things sent to clients for signatures, if you want a second set of eyes on things, I mean, take us up on it.
Yeah. A simple text message goes a long way. Just say, Rochelle, hey, I just want to make sure I'm sending this notice appropriately. Could you take a look at it? I'm happy to do that. Even by text, if I know that you're in the process of something, I can take a closer look. Even managing brokers. I had a managing broker at one time and that I work with, and he was for a long time, just maybe did not understand how important it was to actually get that notice sent out to that prospective buyer. He did not know he waived all of his rights. They don't teach that type of thing in managing broker school as well, where I think they should. I mean, it's more of an advanced concept, but you might want to have just like read those forms carefully. And if you, again, maybe talk with another managing broker or another broker, just make sure you're understanding it correctly. It's been a long time since many of you have worked on these things. So hopefully this was helpful. I do cover 90K in an earlier call that I did a couple years ago. So if you do want some more education on that particular notice form, you could certainly listen to that recording. But for the most part, I wanted to cover just the overall process of the home sale process. Thanks, Deanne, for that compliment. Sometimes I don't know whether I cover enough for you guys or cover too much. So I appreciate that compliment, and thank you, Debbie, for that compliment as well. If there is feedback or if you have questions, go definitely. I take feedback well. I'm not all knowing. Mary, thank you for the feedback. Is there something that you've wondered about, as far as the clause or working with a seller or a buyer on the home sale contingency? Love to take your questions. Kathy, she had one that happened with 5 homes. Oh, wow. Yeah, and those require, you might have to have addenda written as well. If there's 5 homes in the domino, where we actually have to get permission. There are permission things when things are closing quickly because of the way the closing dates are written in our home sale contingencies. When one thing closes, that's what triggers the closing date. So in Washington State, if you are accepting something that's less than 30 or more than 60, it requires permission from the seller if you are going to send them a copy of that. That's great.
Yeah, and I think I'll echo, I think what Candace and I were talking about the other day, where she was talking about how there's a lot of buy-up buyers right now. So taking advantage of submitting an offer with a home sale contingency, people are actually open to receiving those types of offers. You'd be surprised. So if you've got people who have been on the fence over the last year or two, or maybe last year when they were getting beat out by these cash offers, 100K over list price, I mean, this is the market they've been waiting for. I mean, they've really been waiting for something like this where they can get into that next house. Maybe they had another kid, maybe they need more space, maybe they have, or they're needing to downsize. They don't need as much space,
right?
They're getting older, who knows? So, I mean, that's why there is a market for everybody, in this type of market where people will always be selling, people will always be buying. So this is a great time to be picking up some deals that, a year ago, there's no way they would have been able to get into a house like that.
Yep. And buyers are sellers. So if you're like, gosh, I really want to get into listings, start talking with those buyers that you have that were on the fence. I think Shannon's right. They are most likely sellers. We talked about that last week a little bit. So get on the phone, start talking about, there's some opportunities out there that we can go to. Let's write up an offer. Let's see. I mean, it's been on the market for 35 days, 45 days. That's a great one where you could probably write a home sale contingency and you may get the seller to respond, and again, don't be crazy. Don't be crazy and asking for the world. I mean, you certainly have to put it on paper. If the client's asking you to write something below asking, you got to write it up. But let's be smart about how we present those offers. A home sale contingency is a reduction in price for a seller sometimes because they, the timing and all of that, they're not going to get their money and they're going to be carrying a mortgage for that period of time. So be smart about how you structuring it. But, that's a great time. It's look at the days on market, and that might be a clue for you to go in and ask for a home sale contingency in your offer if your buyer has something or your seller has a home to sell as well. So have a great week, you guys. Hopefully that was helpful. I got some good thank you very muches. So that's always a good sign. Thank you for your feedback and for your participation. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next Monday. And good luck out there. Let's see some deals coming through. Now's the time.